On the screen, a woman who looked exactly like her was swinging a heavy vase at her uncle's head. It looked violent. It looked undeniable. But she had never done it. How could a lie look so much like the truth? "Your uncle wasn't the beginning of this," the Mafia boss said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "Your father signed something before he died. There's another name on this file, and they know what you don't know."
The rain didn't just fall that night, it screamed. It washed away the dignity of a woman standing barefoot on the cold, wet pavement outside her own front door. She was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she stared at the glowing windows of the home that was no longer hers. "Please, this is my home," she cried, her voice cracking against the thunder. But in this neighborhood, the truth was expensive, and she was currently bankrupt. Standing on the porch, looking down at her like she was a stray animal, was her uncle. He didn't see a niece, he saw a hurdle between him and a massive inheritance. He pointed a trembling finger at her, his face twisted in a fake mask of terror.
"She tried to attack us!" he shouted to the officers arriving on the scene. "She's unstable! She's dangerous!" The police didn't ask for her side of the story. They didn't see the tears or the bare feet. They only saw a threat described by a wealthy man. Before she could even explain the bruises on her own arms, the cold, heavy metal snapped around her wrists. Click.
Before the story takes a darker turn, I just want to say thank you to everyone supporting this channel. Your likes, your time, your presence here, it means everything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be the perfect moment, because what's coming next, you don't want to miss it.
That sound was the final nail in the coffin of her old life. As the metal bit into her skin, she looked past the police cruisers. Her neighbors were watching from their porches. Some whispered behind their hands, their eyes filled with judgment. Others, people she had invited to dinner just weeks ago, actually laughed. "They're lying! They took everything from me!" she screamed as they forced her toward the patrol car. But the world had already decided she was the villain. As the officer pushed her head down and slammed the car door shut, she caught a glimpse of her cousin standing in the shadows of the foyer. He wasn't crying. He wasn't scared. He was smiling. Why were they so sure the police and the entire world would never believe a single word she said? At the police station, the world moved with a terrifying speed. There was no room for questions or explanations, only the heavy sound of boots on linoleum and the scratch of pens on paper. Before she was even fingerprinted, a thick file was already sitting on the sergeant's desk. It wasn't just a report, it was a tombstone for her reputation. Witness statements were already signed by people she thought were her friends. But the true horror came when the officer turned a computer screen toward her. "I didn't do that. That's not real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. On the screen, a grainy video played. It showed a woman who looked exactly like her, screaming and swinging a heavy vase at her uncle's head. It looked violent. It looked undeniable. She stared in shock, her brain struggling to understand how a lie could look so much like the truth. The officer didn't see a victim of a frame-up. He saw a criminal caught on tape. He looked at her with eyes as cold as the cell waiting for her. To the law, every single detail pointed to her guilt. Her name was ruined before she could even call a lawyer. Her voice, her truth, and her life no longer mattered in the face of evidence. They led her down a dim hallway, the smell of old coffee and bleach filling the air. As the heavy iron door of a small, dark cell groaned shut, the finality of it hit her like a physical blow. She collapsed onto the thin cot, her fingers tracing the cold stone walls. "Someone, please see the truth," she whispered into the darkness. She felt completely alone, buried alive by a family who wanted her dead. But far away, across the city, in a room filled with shadows and secrets, someone was looking at her file. Someone who knew exactly what a lie looked like. Cliffhanger. Who was watching her case from the shadows? And why did the sight of her name make his blood run cold? In a quiet room, far from the chaos of the city, a man sat alone in a leather chair. The only light came from a single lamp, casting long shadows across the tattoos that crawled up his muscular arms. His eyes were sharp and cold, like a predator watching for movement in the dark. This was a man people moved aside for in the streets, a powerful mafia boss who dealt in power and secrets. Usually he didn't care about strangers or the small dramas of the world. He lived in a world where you took what you wanted and crushed those who stood in your way. But tonight, something felt wrong. A case file sat on his desk, and the face staring back at him from the photo didn't look like a criminal. He looked at her file again. Then he read it a third time. Slowly, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the police reports. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered to the empty room. His trained eyes found a detail everyone else had missed. Just one tiny mistake. A timestamp on the video footage that did not match the weather report from that night. It was a digital fingerprint left behind by someone who was trying too hard to be perfect. The mafia boss didn't call his lawyer. He didn't wait for morning. He stood up without a word or a warning. He grabbed his coat and headed straight for the police station. He wasn't going there to file a complaint. He was going there to remind the law that some secrets are too dangerous to keep. What happens when a man more powerful than the law walks into the station to claim a woman he isn't even supposed to know?
The police station was a hive of noise and indifference. Phones rang off the hook. Officers traded jokes over lukewarm coffee, and the sound of rustling papers filled the air. It was a place where people were processed like numbers, not humans. Then the heavy front doors swung open, and the noise died in instant death. A man walked in. He didn't rush, and he didn't shout. He moved with a slow, calm confidence that screamed danger. Every person in that room felt the temperature drop. One officer, trying to regain his authority, stepped forward to block the path. "Sir, you can't just come back here." The man didn't even slow down. He looked through the officer as if he were made of glass.
"I'm here about the girl you arrested," he said, his voice low and steady.
The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Several officers exchanged nervous looks, while others suddenly found reasons to look at their desks, avoiding all eye contact. They knew something was wrong with that arrest, and they knew exactly who this man was. The officer in charge forced a stiff, fake smile. "Her case is clear, sir. We have the footage. She attacked her family." The mafia boss tilted his head slightly, his eyes tracking the officer's nervous sweat. "Then show me the raw footage," he demanded. He didn't want the polished report or the edited clips they had shown the media. He wanted the real, unedited truth. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Why were the police so terrified of letting a stranger see the original video files? The silence in the room was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happened right before a storm breaks. For a long minute, no one moved. Then the officer in charge gave a small, stiff nod. Minutes later, they brought out a laptop and opened a video file. "Here," the officer said, his voice tight. "This is the proof you asked for." The room gathered around the small screen. The video played, showing the girl in the middle of a heated argument. On the screen, she looked out of control. She was shouting, her face twisted with anger, and she moved with a sudden, violent speed toward her uncle. To anyone watching, it looked bad, very bad. It looked like the perfect evidence of a crime. But the Mafia boss didn't look away. He leaned in closer, his eyes fixed on the flickering pixels. "Play that again," he commanded. The officer clicked the button. They watched it a second time, then a third. Suddenly, the Mafia boss raised a hand, signaling them to stop. He reached out and paused the frame, zooming in on a corner of the screen where the light hit the floor. "Look at her shadow," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The room froze. Everyone leaned in, squinting at the grainy image. And then they saw it. On the floor, her shadow moved a fraction of a second before her body did. It was a tiny detail, something so small that most people would never notice it in a lifetime. But in the world of high-tech digital work, it was a death sentence for the truth.
That's just a glitch,"
the officer stammered, his face turning a pale shade of gray. The Mafia boss smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No," he said, looking the officer right in the eye. "That's not a glitch. That's editing." If the video was fake, how deep did the lie actually go? And who had enough power to rewrite reality? The air in the room turned heavy, like the atmosphere before a massive lightning strike. The Mafia boss stood up slowly, his presence filling the cramped office until the walls seemed to shrink. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words made the floor feel unstable. "Bring in the uncle," he said. The officer in charge hesitated, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the desk. We don't have the authority to bring a citizen back in without a warrant," he stammered. But before the argument could go any further, a phone on the desk rang. Another officer picked it up, listened for a few seconds, and then went completely pale. He hung up the phone with trembling fingers and whispered to his boss, "Sir, we should cooperate." A few minutes later, the uncle was led back into the room. He didn't look like a man who had just been caught in a lie. He was still wearing his expensive suit, still confident, and still smiling that fake, oily smile. He looked at his niece through the glass and shook his head with mock sadness. "She's crazy," he told the room, his voice loud and clear. "We tried to help her, but she's lost her mind." The Mafia boss said nothing. He didn't argue. He didn't get angry. He simply turned the laptop around and placed it directly in front of the uncle. He hit play and then paused it exactly on the frame where the shadow moved out of sync. The uncle looked at the screen. For a second, just one tiny second, his smile slipped. A flash of pure panic crossed his eyes. Then he forced a laugh. "I don't know what that is," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Technology is glitchy these days." But it was too late. The energy in the room had shifted. The officers weren't looking at the girl anymore. They were looking at the man in the expensive suit. The lie was no longer a solid wall. It was a sheet of glass with a massive crack running right down the middle. If he slipped once under just a little bit of pressure, what would happen when the real truth was dragged into the light? The air in the room felt tight, like a wire stretched until it was ready to snap. No one spoke, and the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The uncle sat frozen, his eyes glued to the laptop screen as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Then, suddenly, the heavy silence was shattered. A young officer rushed into the room, his chest heaving as if he had been running. "Sir, there's someone here asking about the case," he panted, looking directly at the sergeant. The Mafia boss didn't even turn his head. His gaze remained fixed on the uncle, his expression unreadable. Who? He asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The young officer swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the uncle. A maid from the house, he whispered. At those words, the uncle's head snapped up. The confidence that had been his shield for the last hour vanished in an instant, replaced by a flash of pure, cold fear. "Send her away!" he barked, his voice jumping an octave. "She's just a worker. She knows nothing about our family business." The Mafia boss finally turned. He looked at the uncle with a slow, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Bring her in," he said, his voice quiet but final. The door to the interview room opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. A small woman stepped inside, her hands shaking so hard she had to tuck them into her pockets. She kept her head down, avoiding the uncle's furious glare. I saw something that night," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. The room froze once more. The uncle slammed his hand on the metal table with a loud bang, making everyone jump. "She's lying! She's trying to extort us!" he screamed. But the maid didn't back down. Slowly, she raised her eyes and pointed a shaking finger directly at the man in the expensive suit. "They told me to stay quiet, or I would be next," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word. What did she see through the keyhole that night? A secret so terrifying it could destroy even the most powerful people in the city? The maid's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a steady drumbeat of justice. She stood her ground while the uncle's face turned from red to a ghostly white. "They planned everything days before it even happened," she said, her voice shaking but clear. The room watched in total silence as she began to tear the lie apart, piece by piece. She explained how the arguments had been staged specifically for the cameras and how the edited videos had been prepared in advance to look like a real attack. The legal papers had even been signed before the police were called, showing that her arrest was part of a cold, calculated business deal. Then she said the one thing that made the officers step back in horror. She never attacked them. They drugged her. A heavy, crushing silence hit the room like a physical blow. The officer in charge, who had been so sure of his evidence, stepped back, his mouth hanging open. This changes everything," he muttered. The uncle stood up so fast, his chair flipped over. "This is nonsense! She is a servant! She has no proof of these lies!" he screamed, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The maid didn't argue. Instead, she slowly reached into her small bag. She pulled out a cheap, cracked smartphone and laid it on the table. "I didn't just watch," she said. "I recorded it." The Mafia boss reached out and pressed the play button. Suddenly, the quiet room was filled with voices. They were clear, cold, and incredibly cruel. It was the uncle's voice, unmistakable and loud. "Once she's in custody, it's over. Everything becomes ours," the recording played. With the truth finally exposed for everyone to hear, who would the police arrest first? The man who stole the money, or the officers who helped him do it? The atmosphere in the room exploded into motion. In an instant, the roles were reversed. The air was filled with the sounds of officers shouting, phones ringing, and the frantic chaos of orders being changed mid-breath. The same men who had tightly gripped her arms just hours ago now turned their attention toward her uncle. "Sir, you need to come with us," an officer commanded, stepping into the uncle's personal space. The uncle's face went from pale to a ghostly white. He looked around the room, realizing his power had evaporated the moment that recording started playing. "You can't do this! I'm the victim here!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. But his words were empty noise now. No one was listening to his lies anymore.
Then came the sound that everyone was waiting for. A pair of heavy steel handcuffs was pulled from a belt. Click. The sound echoed off the cold walls of the station. It was the exact same sound that had signaled the end of the girl's world earlier that night. Now it signaled the end of his. Outside, the world was already waking up to the scandal. News cameras had arrived, their bright lights cutting through the rainy night as word of the wrongful arrest and family betrayal spread like wildfire. The perfect lie had been exposed for the whole world to see.
Inside the dim hallway of the holding area, an officer slowly turned a key in a heavy lock. The cell door creaked open. She stepped out into the light, her legs weak and her mind spinning with confusion. She was free, but the nightmare was far from over. As she walked past the Mafia boss, he didn't offer a smile or a congratulation. His eyes were fixed on a new discovery, a secret hidden so deep that it made the uncle's plan look like a game. If the case was already this dark, what was the last secret still waiting in the shadows?
The station was a storm of noise. Reporters were shouting over the roar of rain, cameras were flashing like lightning, and officers were rushing everywhere to manage the chaos. She stood outside the precinct for the first time in days, feeling the cool air hit her skin. She was free, but the victory felt hollow. Everything had happened too fast, too easily. She turned to the Mafia boss, who stood near his car like a shadow carved from stone. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he was staring at a file in his hand, one that wasn't part of the police evidence and one that no one else had seen. Slowly, he turned his cold, sharp eyes toward her. "You need to leave the city," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. Her heart dropped into her stomach. "Why?" she whispered. He stepped closer, his presence cutting through the noise of the reporters. "Because this didn't start with your uncle," he said. She froze as he held up the file. That recording, the plan, the timing, it was all too perfect. "Your father signed something very specific before he died." Her hands began to shake as the realization hit her. "What are you saying?" The Mafia boss's eyes hardened into flint. He knew they were coming for you, but he wasn't just hiding from your uncle. A heavy, crushing silence fell between them. Then he delivered the final blow. "There's another name on this file. The person who approved everything, the person who truly owns your inheritance, is still out there." Behind them, the police dragged her uncle away, his screams for mercy disappearing into the back of a van. But she wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring at the name in the file, a name she recognized, a name she wasn't ready to see. The Mafia boss turned to walk away into the darkness. "Stay alive," he said over his shoulder, "because now they know you're not easy to kill." The camera zooms in slowly on her shaking hands as she opens the paper. "No, it can't be." If you were her, would you trust the Mafia boss or the police right now? Be honest, because the next part will reveal the name in that file. The moral lesson of this story centers on the instability of lies and the unpredictable nature of justice. At its core, the narrative serves as a warning that a perfect lie is never truly perfect. The uncle and his accomplices spent days staging arguments, editing video footage, and pre-signing legal documents to ensure the niece's downfall. However, their downfall was triggered by a single, overlooked detail, a shadow that moved a fraction of a second too early. This illustrates that evil often trips over its own complexity.
The more effort one puts into fabricating a false reality, the more cracks are created for the truth to eventually break through.
Furthermore, the story explores the concept of dangerous mercy and unlikely allies. The police, who are sworn to protect, became the tools of the oppressor because they relied on superficial evidence and corruption. In contrast, justice came from the darkness, a mafia boss who, despite his cold and dangerous nature, possessed the sharp eyes and independence to see the truth that the system ignored. It suggests that truth is an objective force that can be recognized by anyone, regardless of their social standing or moral background. Finally, the ending provides a chilling lesson on the layers of betrayal. While the uncle was the immediate villain, the final secret reveals that the root of the conspiracy was much deeper. It teaches that the pursuit of truth requires resilience, as overcoming one injustice often uncovers a more difficult hidden reality that one must be hard to kill to survive.